Welcome back to the Crypto Intellect, your trusted source for the latest XRP news, crypto regulation updates, and the market developments that could shape the future of digital assets. Today's story may end up being remembered as one of the most important moments in XRP's journey toward mainstream institutional adoption. We are talking about the Clarity Act, a piece of legislation that nearly fell apart before surviving one of the most dramatic committee votes seen in recent crypto history. And according to multiple reports coming out of Washington, the developments surrounding this bill are now fueling speculation that the biggest XRP bull run many investors have been waiting for could be tied directly to the regulatory clarity that institutions have demanded for years. Before we dive into everything that happened, let me remind you that this video is for educational and informational purposes only and should not be considered financial advice. Always do your own research before making investment decisions. If you appreciate deep crypto analysis that goes beyond the headlines, make sure you hit the like button, subscribe, and let's get into what may be one of the most significant XRP developments of the year. What makes this story so important is not simply that a bill moved forward, it is the fact that the bill almost did not survive at all. According to individuals familiar with the negotiations, lawmakers were still scrambling to secure support literally minutes before the Senate Banking Committee hearing began. Amendments were being revised in real time, staff members were rushing paperwork between offices, senators were negotiating behind closed doors while the hearing itself was already underway. The entire situation demonstrates just how significant and controversial this legislation has become. When lawmakers are willing to continue negotiations until the very last minute, it tells you that everyone involved understands the stakes. This is not just another piece of legislation moving quietly through Congress. This is a bill that could establish the first comprehensive legal framework for digital assets in the United States. For XRP holders, that matters because regulatory uncertainty has been one of the largest barriers preventing broader institutional participation in the market. To understand why investors are paying so much attention, you first need to understand what the Clarity Act actually does. The legislation is designed to create a clear legal structure for digital assets across the United States. For years, crypto companies, exchanges, banks, and investors have operated in an environment where the rules often seemed unclear or even contradictory. Different agencies have sometimes taken different positions regarding how digital assets should be classified and regulated. That uncertainty has created hesitation among major financial institutions. Large banks do not like legal ambiguity. Payment providers do not like uncertainty. Public companies generally avoid environments where future regulatory changes could create significant liabilities. The Clarity Act aims to reduce that uncertainty by placing clear definitions and responsibilities directly into federal law. That distinction is critical because laws passed by Congress provide a level of permanence that agency guidance alone simply cannot offer. One of the most overlooked aspects of this legislation is how important it could be for long-term institutional planning. Many investors focus on short-term market reactions, but large financial institutions think differently. Banks build infrastructure that may remain operational for decades. They cannot afford to make billion-dollar technology decisions based on temporary policy interpretations that could change with a future administration. This is exactly why so many institutions have remained cautious despite growing interest in blockchain technology. They wanted legal clarity before fully committing resources. The Clarity Act addresses that concern by creating a framework that offers more certainty about how digital assets can be used, traded, and integrated into financial systems. For XRP supporters who have spent years arguing that institutional adoption would eventually arrive once regulations became clearer, this legislation represents a potential turning point in that thesis. The drama surrounding the committee vote only adds to the significance of what happened. Reports indicate that negotiations had nearly collapsed the night before the hearing. Lawmakers had reportedly made progress on several politically sensitive issues, but disagreements remained over important provisions affecting blockchain developers and decentralized applications. These discussions became so contentious that observers genuinely questioned whether the bill would have enough support to advance. As committee members arrived for the hearing, uncertainty remained high. Even minutes before proceedings officially began, there were concerns that sufficient votes had not been secured. That level of uncertainty makes the eventual outcome even more meaningful. The bill did not simply cruise through the committee process. It survived a genuine political battle, and that survival sends an important signal regarding the growing bipartisan interest in creating a workable regulatory framework for digital assets. As the hearing progressed, negotiations reportedly continued behind the scenes. Senators and staff members worked through amendment language while the public portion of the hearing moved forward. Multiple revisions were discussed, rewritten, and circulated in real time. Observers described the process as chaotic but productive. Eventually, lawmakers reached agreements on several critical amendments that helped move the legislation forward. Among those revisions were provisions related to banking participation in digital asset activities, tokenization initiatives, consumer protections, and safeguards involving market conduct. These changes may sound technical, but they matter because they help shape the environment in which digital asset businesses will operate in the future. Every amendment represents another piece of the foundation that could support broader adoption of blockchain technology across traditional finance. When the final vote was announced, the bill passed with bipartisan support. That detail is extremely important. A purely party-line vote could have created significant concerns about the legislation's prospects moving forward. Bipartisan backing suggests that support for digital asset regulation is becoming broader and more politically durable. Markets generally respond positively when there is evidence that major policy initiatives are attracting support from both sides of the aisle. For XRP investors, this matters because legislation with bipartisan support often has a stronger chance of advancing through future stages of the legislative process. While there are still hurdles ahead, the committee vote demonstrated that momentum exists and that the conversation surrounding digital asset regulation is becoming increasingly serious within Washington. Now let's connect this directly to XRP. For years, XRP's story has been tied closely to regulatory developments. The asset spent years under the shadow of legal uncertainty, and many institutions chose to remain cautious because they wanted greater clarity before expanding involvement. If the Clarity Act eventually becomes law, it could significantly alter that environment. Financial institutions that previously hesitated may find themselves operating under a framework that provides greater confidence and predictability. That confidence could encourage increased experimentation, partnerships, and infrastructure development involving blockchain-based payment solutions. Since XRP has long positioned itself as a bridge asset for efficient value transfer, a clearer regulatory landscape could create opportunities that were previously difficult to pursue. One reason many analysts are paying attention to this legislation is because it directly addresses concerns that have prevented institutions from moving faster. Imagine being responsible for a major bank's technology strategy. Your team identifies potential benefits from blockchain integration, including faster settlements, lower transaction costs, and improved cross-border capabilities. Yet your legal department warns that future regulatory changes could create unexpected liabilities. In that scenario, caution becomes the logical choice. The Clarity Act attempts to change that calculation. By establishing clearer legal standards, it reduces some of the uncertainty that has historically discouraged institutional participation. This is why many observers believe the legislation could unlock a wave of adoption that extends far beyond XRP and affects the broader digital asset ecosystem. The banking provisions included in the discussions have generated particular interest. Banks and credit unions have increasingly explored blockchain technology, but many have waited for greater certainty before deploying significant resources. Explicit language supporting digital asset activities could provide an important foundation for future initiatives. Financial institutions often move slowly, but once regulatory conditions become favorable, adoption can accelerate rapidly. Investors sometimes expect overnight transformations, but the reality is that infrastructure development occurs over time. What matters is creating the conditions that allow those developments to begin. The Clarity Act may represent one of the most meaningful steps toward creating those conditions. That is why so many industry participants are watching every stage of this legislative process so closely. Another important aspect of this story involves the broader ecosystem beyond XRP itself. Discussions surrounding the legislation frequently reference tokenization, decentralized finance, stablecoins, and blockchain-based financial infrastructure. These sectors are interconnected. Growth in one area often supports growth in others. If regulatory clarity encourages more institutions to participate in digital asset markets, the effects could ripple throughout the industry. Greater participation can lead to increased liquidity, expanded use cases, and more investment in infrastructure. XRP supporters often focus on payment utility, but the reality is that broader industry adoption could create benefits that extend across multiple blockchain networks and applications. Regulatory clarity has the potential to act as a catalyst for the entire ecosystem. Despite the optimism, it is important to recognize that significant work remains. The committee vote was an important milestone, but it was not the finish line. lawmakers still need to address unresolved issues. Additional negotiations will likely take place. Different versions of the legislation may need to be reconciled. Questions surrounding ethics provisions and enforcement concerns remain active topics of discussion. These are not minor details. They represent genuine policy challenges that lawmakers must address before final legislation can be finalized. Investors should understand that progress does not guarantee immediate success. Legislative processes are often complex and unpredictable. However, the fact that the bill survived such a difficult committee stage suggests that momentum remains on its side. One of the most interesting observations from industry leaders is that regulatory clarity alone may not be enough. Several advocates have emphasized that tax policy will also play a major role in determining whether the United States becomes a leading destination for digital asset innovation. Companies consider multiple factors when deciding where to build, invest, and launch products. Regulatory clarity is critical, but competitive tax treatment can also influence those decisions. This means the Clarity Act may represent only one piece of a larger puzzle. Even so, many observers view it as the foundational piece. Without clear rules governing digital assets, other reforms become much more difficult to implement effectively. For long-term XRP holders, the developments surrounding the Clarity Act reinforce a narrative that many have followed for years. The argument has always been that institutional adoption would eventually require legal certainty. While speculation often focuses on price predictions and market cycles, the deeper story has always involved infrastructure, regulation, and institutional participation. The committee vote suggests that the regulatory side of that equation may finally be moving in a meaningful direction. That does not guarantee immediate price appreciation, but it does provide evidence that structural changes continue to develop beneath the surface. Markets often react to expectations long before full implementation occurs, which is why investors pay such close attention to these legislative milestones. What happened inside Washington this week was not simply another political event. It was a glimpse into how seriously policymakers are beginning to treat digital assets as part of the future financial system. The fact that lawmakers were willing to engage in intense negotiations to keep this legislation alive demonstrates that the conversation has evolved significantly. Crypto is no longer being discussed solely as a speculative asset class. It is increasingly being viewed as a technology that may require comprehensive legal frameworks and long-term policy planning. That shift in perception is important because it creates opportunities for more constructive engagement between regulators, lawmakers, financial institutions, and industry participants. When you step back and look at the bigger picture, four major trends appear to be moving simultaneously: legislative clarity, regulatory clarity, banking clarity, and accounting clarity. Each one has the potential to influence institutional adoption. Together, they could create conditions unlike anything the digital asset industry has experienced before. This convergence is why many analysts believe the next phase of crypto adoption could look very different from previous market cycles. Instead of being driven primarily by retail speculation, future growth may increasingly involve institutions, infrastructure providers, payment networks, and financial service companies operating within clearer legal frameworks. As we wrap up today's update, remember that the headline is not simply that the Clarity Act advanced. The real story is that it nearly failed, survived intense last-minute negotiations, secured bipartisan support, and continues moving through a process that could fundamentally reshape the regulatory environment for digital assets in the United States. For XRP holders, that matters because regulatory certainty has long been viewed as one of the most important ingredients for broader institutional adoption. Whether this ultimately becomes the catalyst for the biggest XRP bull run remains to be seen, but there is no question that the legislative momentum surrounding the Clarity Act is creating excitement across the crypto industry. The next few weeks could be incredibly important as lawmakers continue refining the bill and determining its path forward. Let me know in the comments whether you believe the Clarity Act is the key that finally unlocks large-scale XRP adoption. And if you enjoyed this update, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Thanks for watching the Crypto Intellect. Stay informed, stay prepared, and I will see you in the next one.